So we've got some good news coming out of Hong Kong. It looks like that extradition bill, which would have essentially allowed the Beijing government in China to kidnap whoever they wanted out of Hong Kong with impunity and send them off to the gulag, that's been suspended. Now, interestingly enough, the bill has not actually been withdrawn in the legislature, meaning it is still sort of active, but the government is saying that they're not going to pursue the passage of the bill any further. I'm not sure if that means that they're going to try and pass it again later, or if this is just their way of saving face so that they don't have to actually say that they withdrew the bill. In practice, that seems to be what they've done. In her press conference, Carrie Lam, who is the chief executive of Hong Kong, or sort of like a prime minister sort of role, she said that the bill is going to be suspended indefinitely, and so that means there's no real timetable for when they're going to try and pick up this issue again. There is talk, though, however, of a new extradition bill being brought up, as opposed to this current one. And of course, that means that in the new bill, there's talk that they would fix the main problem with this one, which was that there's no provision saying that people have to receive a fair trial. This particular extradition bill essentially abolished the right to due process, which, you might think that's kind of a big deal. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of optimism now that the bill's been suspended, not pulled, amongst the Hong Kong dissident community. They don't seem to be particularly satisfied with Miss Lam's response to their protests, even though the bill is gone. For example, Mrs. Lam did not seem to acknowledge the grievances of the protesters in her announcement of the suspension of the bill. She essentially said that she was suspending the bill because of the protest, but she didn't accept that what they thought was really valid. She thought that the bill itself is still great and all that, and she would love to pass it if she could, but politically that's just impossible. She even went so far as to say that she's pulling the bill in order to avoid bloodshed in the streets. So this is very clearly a tactical matter rather than an ideological matter. She still thinks that sending off her people to the gulag is just fine. The only problem is that the people are causing too much of a stir. And during this press conference that she held, she was asked 7 times if she would resign, and each time she said no. Now, the protest group leaders are not particularly satisfied with that answer. They want her to resign now. They think that what she's done is pretty much unforgivable, and she didn't even apologize. So they have no real reason to come to her side. It seems as though that her announcing the suspension of this bill has not satisfied at least the leaders of the protest. It'll be interesting to see what turnout is like, because they are still planning to hold their march as scheduled, coming up here. So it'll be interesting to see if they have this same massive turnouts, if people are that upset with Carrie Lam herself, or if they were just mad about this particular bill. I would have to imagine that you would see a steep decline from the last protest now that the bill is gone, because I'm sure, a lot of people were just worried about the immediate effects of losing their right to due process. Now, what I found interesting was Lam's comment about trying to prevent bloodshed in the streets. In the last couple days, we were seeing pictures come out on Twitter of tanks that were supposedly in southern China near Hong Kong that were being shipped on trains and trucks being moved around the area. So some people were speculating that those tanks were going to be sent into Hong Kong to quell the protests. And so if Beijing gave Carrie Lam a bit of a heads up saying, hey, these protests need to stop, so we're going to send in the tanks and start killing people, perhaps that Carrie Lam got a little nervous, and she decided that she'd rather suspend the bill than have that on her conscience. It's certainly not below Beijing to send in the tanks. They've done it plenty of times. Of course, most famous was Tiananmen Square, and Carrie Lam, as a right-thinking person, thankfully does not want to be remembered for presiding over another Tiananmen Square massacre, perhaps one even bigger than what happened in Tiananmen Square. Now, she wasn't that sympathetic, though, at least in her language, to the protesters, even if she may have been in spirit, because she was ragging on them, saying that they were instigating all the violence, and that they were bringing weapons and things. And I mean, they were doing the whole they were doing a very French-style protest, where they were ripping up bricks from the streets and throwing them at cops. And it's not like the protests were completely calm. However, that's not the best way necessarily to quell them, to call them a bunch of violent thugs. You may want to say that, a couple days later, but on the day that you're trying to get them to stop protesting, you kind of want to feel them out a little bit and try and say, hey, I understand what's going on, I feel your pain, as Bill Clinton would say. Carrie Lam, however, does not appear to feel their pain at the very least. It is interesting, though, the level of concern that I was reading in the media in Hong Kong regarding polarization, because polarization obviously is a big problem for any political entity, because you don't want your polity divided into two distinct camps that hate each other. That's not the best recipe for stability in any society, and I think Carrie Lam is recognizing that and essentially wants to de-escalate that polarization. She understands that continuing down the path of this extradition bill will only exacerbate the existing polarization, and so she, as a stateswoman, is trying to preserve the health of the state by not fomenting instability. It's remarkable to see the difference in her attitude versus, say, any U.S. politician, because every U.S. politician loves to ramp up polarization. I guess it's because we have more fair elections here, so they're more, they want to ramp up their base, and in Hong Kong it's not particularly democratic, so Carrie Lam just wants to keep people subdued. But in both cases, polarization is very unhealthy for the state. However, as an enemy of the state, I welcome polarization in the U.S. I'm happy that our politicians have such high time preference and are not really thinking in the long run as to what they're doing and how they're destroying the legitimacy of the U.S. government. Unfortunately, for the folks in Hong Kong and in China more broadly, their government seems to be far more, perhaps not intelligent is the right word, but rather strategically competent. And frankly, that means that given the relative instability in both countries, I think that you very well may see a collapse of the U.S. before you ever see a democratization and the independence of Hong Kong, both of which are obviously very extreme cases. But I think that the Hong Kong current government is doing a lot more to try and preserve stability there and de-escalate the polarization. So I think that about does it for today. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day. So I guess I'll see you in the next one.